Good evening, Korea. Good morning, Sweden. Let me introduce myself. My name is Anders Hector. I will be the moderator for this session. And everything we say will be streamed in Korean or English. So you can choose which stream you want to follow. And if you do it on our website, nobelmemorial.kr, there will also be a box where you can ask questions to the speakers during the session, and we encourage you to do that. But first, let me introduce the host of this session, which is the Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea, Ambassador Daniel Wolvén. Please join me on the stage.
Thank you, Anders. Dear guests, distinguished participants, dear friends, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this symposium on the Literature Award of the Nobel Prizes this year, 2021. The subtitle to this session is Rewarding Uncompromising and Compassionate Writing on the Refugees' Experience of Displacement and Life in Exile. We will hear today from Swedish and Korean experts about their views on the award, about Abdulrazak Gurna and his work, and I expect we will also hear about the role of literature for society, and especially about Korean literature in the world and literature from the world in Korea. The Koreas have their own historical experience of displacement, and perhaps there are parallels to be had from reading the works of Mr. Gurna. We need meeting spaces to talk about things and share our views. And during the corona pandemic, this has proven to be more important and also more challenging than ever before. I hope that the Nobel Memorial Program can be such a meeting space for Korean and Swedish people to talk about literature. I hope we will be reaching those of you that are either just curious about the subject or professional experts in this field. Everyone is welcome. This symposium is organized by the Swedish Embassy in Seoul, together with partners in Sweden and here in Korea. These partners are incredibly important to research here in Korea and to cooperation in research between Sweden and Korea. So I extend my heartfelt appreciation to each and to all of you, and especially to the Korea Comparative Literature Association for contributing to making this particular symposium possible. And now we will turn to the Literature Award. Many thanks for your attention. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Ambassador. And like the ambassador said, we turn to the next speaker also, a very important and valued partner to the embassy in conducting the symposia on literature is the Korea Comparative Literature Association, KCLA. And I'm very happy to introduce Woo Sung Kang, Vice Chair of Korea Comparative Literature Association and a Professor of American Literature and Critical Theory at Seoul National University. Please join me on the stage.
안녕하십니까.
Good
Thank
evening.
you for inviting me for this wonderful event. 지금부터는 제가 한국말로
And I will be speaking in Korean from now on.
우선
First of all, the
2021
2021 Nobel Memorial Program has been is very much thanked for inviting me. As I have been introduced, my name is Kang Woo-sung, and I teach at the English Literature and Language Department of Seoul National University. I am the vice chair of the Korea Comparative Literature Association, KCLA, and it's an honor for me to be speaking at such an event. This event has been put together by the Swedish Embassy in Seoul, Mr. Ambassador, and the many staff at the embassy, and I would like to thank them for their efforts. And in particular, for the literature session here, there has been close coordination with the Korea Comparative Literature Association, and I would like to say that you made a very good choice in choosing that partner in us. So the Korea Comparative Literature Association, KCLA, has over the past 50 years conducted research of comparative literature between Korean and overseas literature, and also has promoted Korean literature overseas. Our chair should have been here, but he had a very urgent engagement, so I am speaking here on his behalf. World literature is being researched at the KCLA, and the Nobel Prize in Literature is very closely related to world literature and the issue of translation. That is probably why the Korea Comparative Literature Association was the most appropriate choice as a partner for this event. The laureate of this year, Dr. Abdul Razak Gurna, his selection as the laureate for this year also reflects the exchange of literature between different regions and cultures, and also the introduction of such world literature to world readers around the world through translation. And of course, I was astonished by the news that Dr. Gurna was this year's laureate, because he is not well known in Korea and none of his work has yet been translated and published in Korea. So I would say that only students and scholars and researchers of literature have access to his work, and it is something that must be regretted. However, such events as this will provide much more knowledge and understanding on his work and shed light on his accomplishments, and something that is unfamiliar to many of the Korean audience. African literature and his past in Africa and his life as a writer, which started out after he arrived as a refugee in the UK. And his life, and also, of course, his work will be discussed at this event, and it's going to be very meaningful. And Professor Lee Seok-ho at KAIST is very much involved in research of African literature, and I am also looking forward to the discussion session, which will see Professor Ko In-han as a panelist. I would like to extend my thanks yet again to the Swedish Embassy, and I hope to see many more such events to enhance cooperation between Korea and Sweden, and also promote Korean literature and also world literature in Korea as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kang. We all agree with you. That would be amazing if we can continue doing this. Universities are incredibly important to the embassy, but also to many others, and for literature, for research mobility, and for exchange of experiences. We want to introduce 5 university partners that are helping us making these symposia possible. And they will be giving welcoming remarks with video messages, because the Swedish universities are not able to be here. So I'm going to introduce, in order, first the president of Ewha Women's University, which is where we are having this session, Unmi Kim. President of University of Gothenburg, Eva Wiberg. President of KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, Sigbrit Karlsson. President of Lund University, Erik Renström. And the President of Umeå University, Hans Adolfsson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Sweden-Korea Nobel Memorial Program held at Ewha Women's University in Seoul. My name is In-mi Kim, and as president of Ewha Women's University, I would like to convey my appreciation to His Excellency Ambassador Daniel Wolven and the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul for their hard work in organizing this event to honor the Nobel Prize. The Swedish Embassy in Korea and Ewha have been cooperating in many ways in order to promote deeper understanding about our two great nations. Thanks to the generosity of the Swedish Embassy in Korea, Ewha was able to invite many distinguished guests from Sweden over the years. I hope we will continue this tradition into the future so that our two nations will be able to deepen as well as broaden our cooperation. I would like to applaud and congratulate this year's winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, Dr. Abdullah Gurnar, who was born in Zanzibar and has been active in the United Kingdom. This year's Nobel Prize in Literature is ever more meaningful to Koreans as we have also lived through colonialism and in some respects still dealing with the traces of trauma, although the events have been many decades ago in the distant past. I'm most curious to listen to Dr. Gurnar's stories and to read his books. While much of the limelight has been bestowed upon natural sciences and engineering in this day of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, it is still ever more important to listen to the creative stories coming from humanities and especially literature, which is deeply rooted in our existence and the sense of being. I look forward to today's discussion, and I'm confident that it will be creative, inspiring, and moving. I hope you will all enjoy today's discussions. Thank you very much.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. My name is Eva Weiberg, and I'm the president of the University of Gothenburg. I'm honored and proud that my university is part of this excellent Nobel Memorial Program, and I wish that I could have been with you in person to take part of the presentations. Due to the pandemic, this is of course not possible. The pandemic has brought us many challenges. Perhaps the most important of all for the higher education community is for us to preserve and nurture global conversations, like this one between Sweden and South Korea. The University of Gothenburg is a broad and comprehensive university with a strong research focus. One of our strongest research areas is within political science and in public opinion, democracy and elections. In this field of political science, there is also an established research collaboration with Yonsei University. The collaboration is also strong within education, where the university has exchanged 200 students with Korean universities over the years. We are hoping that this is only the beginning of an intensified collaboration in education and research with the Korean higher education community. The Nobel Prizes are the greatest celebrations of science. In the year of 2000, the same year when Kim Dae-jung from South Korea was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Arvid Carlsson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Gothenburg, was one of 3 laureates in physiology medicine. A celebration of science, truth and facts, such as the Nobel Prizes, are of increased importance in challenging times when the international community must act jointly to fight a pandemic. It is with pleasure and pride I see the development of this joint collaboration between our two countries. I hope to meet you all in person in Korea during next year's Nobel Memorial Program.
KTH is happy to be partner in this event And in times like this, it is even more important to keep connected. KTH is the oldest and largest technical university in Sweden with attractive education and world-leading research. KTH is an international university with some 30% of faculty having international background. Yearly, we have an inflow of about 1,000 international students. Korea is important to KTH for further exchange of students and more of excellent research collaborations. With KTH being an international leading engineering university, we'd like to deepen our collaboration as Korea is a world-leading nation in engineering and innovation. I see many similarities and mutual interests. I would like to see more Swedish students going to Korea to tap into the world-leading education and research, but also to learn more about the Korean culture. In the coming years, I'd like to see more research collaborations and more of academia-industry collaborations. Being a part of this Nobel Memorial Program, I just have to take the possibility to tell you about a real pride for KTH. Hannes Alfvén. He is our first but not last Nobel laureate. Professor Alfvén got the Nobel Physics Prize in 1970, and he is considered a pioneer in the field of plasma physics, and his discoveries play a crucial role in today's space research. I have visited Korea a couple of times, and it's a fascinating country. Already in 2013, I joined a delegation of Swedish rectors who visited a large number of excellent universities in the Seoul area. I have really enjoyed my stays. I was impressed by the high quality of the universities and the amazing labs for experimental research. I look forward to once again come back to Korea in real life. For us at KTH, this event is an opportunity to further engage KTH in deeper discussions to increase the ties with your wonderful country.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Lund University, I wish you a warm welcome to the Nobel Memorial Symposia. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic that has plagued the world for a year and a half, academic institutions all over the world are in the process of contemplating the lessons learned and trying to navigate in a partially new landscape. All over the globe, decision makers and us academics try to articulate the clearest idea about how to move forward after the pandemic. Frequently, the center stage of these plans is occupied by us and what we do: education, science, and innovation. Sweden has a long and solid reputation as a country where the value of innovation and research is highly regarded. The Nobel Prizes are excellent testimonies to this notion. Personally, I feel strongly about this year's prize in physiology or medicine. Myself being an MD, PhD and ion channel researcher, I'm in awe of the achievements of David Julius and Arden Petapoutian for the discoveries of the receptors for temperature and touch. Swedes admire great advances in science, medicine, arts, and appreciate their importance for building a sustainable and democratic society. Therefore, South Korea is a country that we feel close affinity to. You cherish the same values about important matters in life and nurture science and innovation. We all hope to be able to meet you in person soon again to maintain, no, strengthen the bonds between our countries. I wish you all a stupendous meeting.
Dear friends of Korea and Sweden, my name is Hans Adolfsson and I'm the Vice Chancellor of Umeå University. We are very happy to be part of the second Swedish-Korean Nobel Memorial Program today. Last year, Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the groundbreaking discovery of the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors, one of gene technology's sharpest tools. At the time of the discovery, Emmanuelle Charpentier was a visiting professor at Umeå University. She often mentioned Umeå as a place where she really could focus on her research and that the university provided a great platform for networking and sharing ideas. Umeå University's strong research areas include, for example, global health, infection biology, plant and forest biotechnology, aging and population studies, and Arctic research. The university campuses encourage cross-border meetings between students, researchers, teachers, and external parties alike. Through close collaboration with local and international stakeholders, we contribute in making new and exciting things possible in society. This is of critical importance now, when we experience a huge sustainable industrial development in the north of Sweden, building plants for car batteries and green steel production. Umeå University has been collaborating with the embassy in Seoul since 2013. We currently have 7 partner universities in Korea and would like to develop further partnerships and to extend the relationships regarding research collaborations. I personally had the opportunity to visit Seoul in 2014, and it was a great experience. Therefore, I do look forward to visit Korea again soon as it's possible. And hopefully next year's Nobel Memorial Program physically can take place in Seoul. In the meantime, I hope that you will enjoy this year's program and do take care.
Thank you very much for those messages, and we really hope that we will be able to meet here in Seoul next year. So let's start this session on literature, and I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, which is Professor Maria Olausen. Are you there, Professor Olausen? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am here. Good morning and good evening, everyone.
Good morning and good evening. Fantastic. And we hear you and we see you as well. Professor Olausen is Professor of English at the Department of Language and Literature at the University of Gothenburg, and a research affiliate of Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She has published widely on African literature, gender studies and post-colonial studies, including on the Literature Laureate 2021, Abdul Razak Gurna. A very warm welcome to you, Professor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this welcome, and thank you for inviting me to present on Gurna's work. The title of my presentation is It Was the Moment at the Start of a Story, Departures and Arrivals in the Fiction of Abdul Razak Gurna. The Nobel Prize in Literature for 2021 was awarded to the author Abdul Razak Gurna for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents. The author Abdul Razak Gurna was born in Zanzibar in 1948, but he left the island already in 1967 for Britain together with his brother in the aftermath of a violent revolution of 1964. Following a time of hardship and poverty in Britain, both brothers were able to get a university education, and Gurna completed a degree in English. He has since worked as professor of English at the University of Kent at Canterbury, where he specialized in post-colonial literatures in English. In his literary work, there are 10 novels so far. Gurna returns to the Eastern African coast, to the areas of his childhood, and also to the history of migration across the Indian Ocean that brought with it a very specific understanding of shifting power relations. Europeans were latecomers in this area, and they too brought with them new cultural codes and expectations, as well as a legacy of violence and coercion. In the title of my talk, I use a quote from Gurna's novel By the Sea. It was the moment at the start of a story. To illustrate precisely this experience that the Nobel Committee talks about here, the gulf between cultures and continents. What is at stake in this description is the connection between the historical events of colonialism and the fate of the refugee on the one hand, and the importance of storytelling and the imagination on the other. And these are all central to the work of Abdul Razak Gurnah. The passage from the novel By the Sea leading up to this moment at the start of a story illustrates the importance of storytelling when exploring global events of migration and power struggles. Here, the main character, Saleh Omar, a man in his mid-60s, newly arrived as a refugee in Britain, thinks back to his childhood experience as a schoolboy in Zanzibar. One of the most memorable experiences concern maps. I speak to maps, and sometimes they say something back to me. This is not as strange as it sounds, nor is it an unheard of thing. Before maps, the world was limitless. It was maps that gave it shape and made it seem like a territory, like something that could be possessed, not just laid waste and plundered. Maps made places on the edges of the imagination seem graspable and placeable. In this quote, we can see how Gurnah connects imagination with the experience of new places. Another important aspect of his work concerns the exploration of how this experience of new cultures and continents is part of a history of global movements steeped in the desire for conquests and ongoing power struggles. The first map that the character sees as a 7-year-old schoolboy in Zanzibar is presented in a context of conquest and expansion, but it is nevertheless connected, strongly connected to positive forces of imagination and to the enchantment of stories. The teacher introduced his subject in a dramatic fashion. He held up a hen's egg between thumb and forefinger. Who can tell me how to make this egg stand up on its end? That was how he introduced Christopher Columbus to us. It was a fabulous and unrepeatable moment, as if I too had stumbled across an unimagined and unexpected continent. It was the moment at the start of a story. In this passage, we see how the little boy identifies with the seafarers and the adventurers who set out on dangerous voyages. It is through departures and arrivals that new experiences are forged. They open up the possibilities for that which has hitherto been part of the unimagined and unexpected, that which exists before the stories but constitute the moment at the start of a story. The teacher continues with his lesson. As his story developed, he began to draw a map on the blackboard with a piece of white chalk. The coast of Northwest Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, Southern Europe, the land of Shams, Syria and Palestine, the coast of North Africa, which then bulged out and tucked in and then slid down to the Cape of Good Hope. As he drew, he spoke, naming places, sometimes in full, sometimes in passing, sinuously north to the jet of the Rovuma Delta, the cusp of our stretch of coast, the Horn of Africa, then the Red Sea coast to Suez, the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, India, the Malay Peninsula, and then all the way to China. He stopped there and smiled. Having drawn half the known world in one continuous line with his piece of chalk, he put a dot halfway down the east coast of Africa and said, "This is where we are, a long way from China." This memorable moment in the childhood of the character Saleh Omar remains as a foundation for the way he continues to connect his experience as a refugee to the power of words and stories to shape the world. What is remarkable about the way the teacher draws the map is that it incorporates a larger part of the world than that described through the figure of Christopher Columbus and the aspirations of European expansion. It incorporates the history of a migration across the Indian Ocean and the awareness of various rulers who have occupied and shaped the places the teacher points out on the map. This information about maps and the description of childhood memories of places also gain additional significance from the situation the protagonist finds himself in the present. Saleh Omar arrives in Britain by air and he asks for asylum. "I am a refugee, an asylum seeker." These are not simple words, even if the habit of hearing them makes them seem so. It is a familiar minor climax in our stories, leaving what we know, arriving in strange places, carrying little bits of jumbled luggage, and suppressing secret and garbled ambitions. Even when reflecting on his life from the vantage point of this precarious situation, the protagonist chooses to think in terms of the choice of words and the way his experience is formed as a story. Among the little piece of jumbled luggage that he himself carries is a casket of incense, a token of the history of connection across the Indian Ocean and of complicated business transactions and friendships that he has now left behind. Gurner's prose also carries little bits of jumbled luggage in the form of expressions in both Swahili and in Arabic that shape the narrative and lend it a particular rhythm and cadence. This novel, By the Sea, as well as his other novels, contain references to Islamic prayers and sayings, as well as descriptions of the importance of a Muslim sense of community among the characters who travel, depart, and arrive. The secret and garbled ambitions that are referred to in this quote, they refer to the future, to the dreams of new possibilities, and the conviction that he might find refuge in the global awareness of atrocities committed, in the recognition that his life had long been in danger. Here we also come across something characteristic of Gurner's style, the reworking of memory within the framework of new expectations with a critical distance to both the past and the future. His protagonists often find themselves in difficulties, partly due to their inability to understand the new contexts they find themselves in, but also due to some strange and inexplicable choices they make. Some of these choices are rendered in a humorous style with a dry wit, and they draw our attention to the absurdities of life. These incidents also stress the human need for connection and the ability to find meaning and sustenance in the retelling of difficult events. When the protagonist Saleh Omar here reflects on his experience of departure and arrival, he does this through the familiar trope we see of leaving that which we know and leaving what we know and arriving in strange places. These tropes build on the Africa-Europe dichotomy, and as Saleh Omar knows, they are only a small part of an older, more complicated history of departures and arrivals. The novel Paradise is set in Eastern Africa around the turn of the last century. It involves a history of migration across the Indian Ocean. What is significant about this novel is the way in which arrivals are depicted from the point of view of those who receive the new visitors, and the departures also involve those left behind. The boy Yusuf lives in a poverty-stricken family, but when the trader Aziz arrives, he brings excitement, food, and the promise of adventure. His uncle Aziz also came to visit them at that time. His visits were brief and far between, usually accompanied by a crowd of travelers and porters and musicians. He stopped with them on the long journeys he made from the ocean to the mountains, to the lakes and forests, and across the dry plains and the bare rocky hills of the interior. The long journeys here refer to the trading expeditions bringing goods along the old slave routes from the interior to the coast and across the Indian Ocean, only to be reversed when the wind changed direction and other goods are brought from the east to be traded along the African coast. The excitement at the arrival of travelers and porters and musicians, and all the wonderful food that Uncle Aziz brings into their household, slowly turns into forebodings of something more serious to happen, something sinister, a new type of departure. When his mother asked him what he was doing, he replied that he was resting. He tried not to say it pompously, but it came out like that, making his mother smile. She reached suddenly for him, hugging him and lifting him up, while he kicked furiously to be released. He hated to be treated like a baby, she knew that. To his amazement, she did not let him go this time. Now she held him, squeezing him to her steeping softness, saying nothing and not laughing. The back of her bodice was still wet with sweat, and her body reeked of smoke and exhaustion. He stopped struggling after a moment and let his mother hold him to her. This was his first foreboding. Yusuf's foreboding comes in the form of an awareness that there is something that his mother knows that concerns him. It is a foreboding of an imminent departure and an end to childhood. Here, the theme of departures is connected to another very common theme in Gurna's fiction, and that is the vulnerability of children in situations of changing power relations. Yusuf's father owes a debt to Uncle Aziz that he's unable to pay. And he therefore has let both his children, Yusuf and his sister, be pawned as unpaid servant to Uncle Aziz. The novel gestures towards the long history of slavery, expressed through tropes of family and developed within complex structures of family hierarchies. Gurna's fiction allows us to experience the vulnerability of departing children from the vantage point of those left behind, the powerless mothers, the helpless fathers who are no longer able to support them. The arrivals and departures depicted in Gurna's novels involve more than the individual asylum seeker finding refuge in Europe. They address the complexity of all meeting points between cultures and continents. They involve a restructuring of narratives, an incorporation of the seemingly strange and inexplicable in the form of expressions that the reader cannot be expected to understand. They point to migration as the starting point of all human endeavors, but also to the moment at the start of a story. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Professor. That was very enjoyable, I might say. I want to welcome up to the stage our next speaker, which is Sekho Lee, a professor at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at KAIST. Please join us on stage, Professor. And Professor Lee have received 2 doctorates, no less. Please have a seat. One from University of Cape Town in South Africa, and one from Hankook University of Foreign Studies in Post-Colonial Theory. And that may be representative also of his research interest, which spans the African Indian Ocean with regard to cross-currents of diverse civilizations. He is also writing books, directing plays, and producing television. Very welcome, Professor.
네, 반갑습니다.
Hello everyone.
소개받은
I am Sekho Lee, as was introduced. I am teaching art and humanities at KAIST. I would like to thank the organizer and the KCLA, the Swedish Embassy, for inviting me here to this illustrious forum. I am not at the liberty of using up too much of your time, so I'll just go right into the main point. Every Thursday on the first week of October, I was very busy for the last few weeks because for several years now, African authors have been talked about as candidates and actual Nobel Literature laureates. It was Ngumia Thiong'o from Kenya a few years ago, and another author who passed away, Chinua Achebe from Nigeria, and Nuruddin Bara from Somalia. They have been mentioned as possible candidates for Nobel Literature Prizes. So for every Thursday on the first week of October, people would call me. There's a high chance that an African author will receive the Literature Prize. And this year, I was forgetting all that. And
the Korean press, I think, for the last 5 years, they were just, they got the false alarms. And they were saying, okay, it will be another author from another continent, so let's not bother Professor Lee. And so there was not much response. And so I thought this autumn was going to pass by quietly. But at 8 p.m. Korea time on the first Thursday of October, I got a call on my phone. And I had to talk to 7 or 8 media agencies for over 1.5 hours. Fortunately, for the last 5 years, the ties that I have had with Dr. Gurna go back because I have been engaged in studies of the Indian Ocean with Professor Go In-hwan, who will appear later in the panel. And I met 2 interesting authors, and one of them is Dr. Gurna. And I think the other writer is also in the scene, writer Basant. I have been following them, and I have met them over the past 5 years when I was engaged in the Indian Ocean studies. So their names are known to me. It's not that I have deep relations with them, but I have some casual relationships with them, and I have read 3 of Dr. Gurna's books. The Swedish embassy has proposed some questions to me in advance, and I would like to present my story based on those questions. My presentation is subtitled Between False Hope and Honest Despair, and the big title is The Never-Ending Narrative of Season of Migration. That is the title of my talk. In Dr. Gurna's stories talk about displacement, and he traverses across Africa and the Indian Ocean, and there are traditions of these regions which have been passed down in his work, but at the same time, there is a departure from the traditions. So at a very idiosyncratic point, he has presented a unique displacement narrative, and that could be the rough definition of his world of literature. With that, I would like to start. Before Gurna, there were several writers from the African Indian Ocean who have written about migration, and there are 2 lineages. The writer Gurna is not the one that developed the canon of the migration narrative. There are other writers who started this. The displacement narrative has been developed by other writers, and let's compare the 2 lineages. There may be some of you who have read it. It's by a Sudanese writer, a Muslim writer, and he wrote Season of Migration to the North. And so it's to the north of the equator. And what you can see from the world literature is you can express it as the global north. So it includes Europe and the US. So in Africa and there is the southern hemisphere, not only Africa but also including Asia and Latin America. The continents to the south of the equator, they used to be colonies of the European Empire. There are writers from the southern hemisphere, and they regard Europe and America as some type of utopia. And so just like migratory birds, the writers wrote about the desire to travel north. And the first attempt, or maybe the grammatical canon, was started by Taif Saleh, who wrote Season of Migration to the North. The global north, including Europe and America, was idealized under such grammar and expressions, and following him, other African writers were influenced, and they idealized Europe and America, and they expressed Orientalism. Europe and America were considered as utopia. And if the North points to Europe and America, the South is pointing to the Southern Hemisphere, including Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And these regions were, compared to Europe and America, considered as barbaric spaces and areas of despair. And that was the symbol used for these continents to the south of the equator. So that is one line created by Taif Saleh, and there is the other lineage. It is a departure from the lineage created by Taif Saleh. From a discourse point of view, it's the opposite, but from a strategy point of view, it is similar because it's a parody of his line of thought. So it's just a reverse, a mirror. And the other lineage is titled Season of Migration to the South. And this is not a novel, it's a collection of essays. It contains a lot of political meditation. It's by a Nigerian writer, a professor, and who is a play critic. It's Kole Omotoso. He's been to Korea many times. In 2007 and in 2012, I had a chance to meet him at a forum, and I invited him, and we had a very interesting discussion as I invited him to a relevant forum in Korea. And there was an essay collection titled Season of Migration to the South, published in the early 2000s. And so the viewpoint about the global South was changed with this piece of work. So what were some of the historic events that reversed the viewpoint? In 1994, Nelson Mandela in South Africa used peaceful methods and was elected as the first black president through a legitimate election. And so with that event, the series of political events had taken a new course, because in the past there were civil wars or coups, and there were violent measures used to take power, and that was the scene in the African continent. But Nelson Mandela had changed the paradigm with a peaceful and legitimate election. And so the Southern Hemisphere was no longer an area of despair, but it had alternatives as good as the global North. And this had presented new opportunities and new ways of looking at global South, and that was started by this essay collection, Season of Migration to the South. If we were to look at the North and the South, of course, it was converted, but the writing strategy remained the same. So in that sense, you could say that there was no huge change. So we have these two lineages of literature. After the 1990s, the displacement and migration narratives are represented by these two perspectives. Writer Gurna, he is characterized by, as I mentioned earlier, abstaining from these two lineages, and he is lingering in between these two perspectives. He's introducing a third perspective that does not belong to either of them. So he's not leaning toward any of these two extremes. He's staying away from them. Of course, he has inherited them partially, but he has denied these two perspectives, and he has taken the middle ground. And he has discovered and is creating a new narrative about migration, and that is the evaluation that is getting from the literary circle. And I think this is in line with the reasons why he has won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Then what defines Gurna's novels? I'd like to talk about 3 or 4 common features. The first characteristic of his novel is that the other writers had this dichotomic viewpoint about either the North being good or the South being utopian, but he has shifted from that perspective and is taking on this perspective of honestly displaying despair. And I'd like to share with you 3 of his novels. And when we look at his fictions, we see that common trait. So he looks at both the South and North, not with some mistaken hope. He's not overly optimistic about either the North or the South. He does not follow the footsteps of the earlier perspectives. He takes the position that both the North and the South are areas of despair. So that's his perspective. Both South and North are areas of despair to him. He's very being honest about it. So, as an example of that, I would like to show you this excerpt. I don't need to read all the sentences. just to be brief about this. This is from his novel, Admiring Silence. So I'd just like to direct your attention to the first sentence. He says, Afro-Caribbean people have dicky hearts. The protagonist is an Indian, and he always uses similar characters. So his novels are sometimes biographical in nature, and looking at the characters and protagonists, the writer's existential traits are reflected on the characters. So you can guess where his writing comes from. So racially, this protagonist is an Indian, and he has the Muslim religion, and he's living in Africa. So these three fragmented pieces of information make up a person that is similar to Gruna. It's an Indian Muslim writer living in Africa. So from the moment he was born, this writer was a refugee from birth, belonging nowhere. So from an existential point of view, idealizing the North and despairing the South, or the reverse, he was bound to deny both of those perspectives, and it is only natural that he adopted neither. So with that in mind, it's very easy to understand where he's coming from. The novel Admiring Silence is about an Indian Muslim residing in Africa in his early 40s. He went to live in the UK, lived with a British woman, had a daughter, and it was at the time his daughter was about 14 years old, and this protagonist had a dicky heart and went to visit a British doctor. And this is the conversation that he has with his British doctor. And the British doctor does not perform medical exams. Intuitively, he looks at the patient's face and diagnoses him, saying that the likes of you, people from the Afro-Caribbean areas, because he has dark skin, he has darker skin. So upon his first glimpse, he says, he's assuming that he's Afro-Caribbean, and Afro-Caribbean people have dicky hearts, and makes this generalization. And he goes on to list common diseases found in the race. It includes high blood pressure and dengue fever, sleeping sickness, diabetes. These diseases are mentioned, and says, something about a series of common diseases found in a certain race. So the protagonist is having this conversation with the doctor. Of course, is not resisting directly to the doctor, but he's an Indian, but he doesn't say to the doctor that I am not Afro-Caribbean. He doesn't rebut out in the open, but he just says internally and is very cynical toward a British doctor, maybe in his early 20s, who is making these racist remarks. So what is interesting from this excerpt is I am Indian and I have Muslim faith and I am from Africa. So it's not Afro-Caribbean. These words are not spoken to the doctor. He cannot. That is why the title is Admiring Silence. So he's living in the south, his hometown, Zanzibar, Tanzania. He came home after 20 years. And he met a British woman, Emma, when he sought asylum in the UK, had a daughter, and came back to his home. And he cannot say that he can meet a woman that his mother arranged for his marriage. So he stays silent again, admiring silence. Europe is exercising direct and indirect violence on this other. But the protagonist remains silent from the violence that he gets from his hometown as well as from the north. And this is the common trait that is found in Gurna's novel. I hope you can have the time to read the excerpts at your leisure. I hope that you can find the characteristics that I mentioned by reading the sentences more in detail. Let's move on to the second excerpt. It's from the novel Memory of Departure. The protagonist is a high school student. He attended high school in Zanzibar, and there was an English teacher who said these words in front of the high school students, including the protagonist. And you can see how Gurna is considering both Global South and North with despair. The English teacher had majored in English literature in the UK. So there's this desire to learn some advanced culture in a more advanced nation. And there's a teacher who had a prior experience. And what this teacher says to his students is, there's the bank clerk and then there's the engineer. I highlighted these words in red. There are the doctors, the graduates. Of course, Africa needs these people. But we don't need philosophers and storytellers. We don't need culture. What Africa needs is bank clerk, engineers, doctors, and graduates, not philosophers and storytellers. So there are different occupations allegedly needed in different parts of the world. Do I have enough time? So what we need to watch out for is, you have to look at this very carefully. Look at the group of professions. If you notice the professions, there's the bank clerk, engineers, doctors, graduates of not just universities but high schools also. in a colonial society or in a post-colonial society, they are very good jobs to be had if you're in a middle class. Doctors, engineers, and high school and university graduates in a colonial society or a post-colonial society, these jobs are good to have if you're the middle class. So what this means is the African natives are not allowed these jobs. The African natives cannot hold these jobs. So if you read between the lines, you have to look at Gurna's existential characteristics again. From Africa, an Indian, and of Muslim faith. He is a refugee by birth. So when he looks at Africa and when he looks at Europe, he looks at the world differently from African writers and from other writers who used to reside in Europe and came back to Africa. There are some Nobel laureates who came back to South Africa. He has different perspectives. So you can read that from these excerpts. I could not cover 1/5 of the materials. I am sorry that I could not manage my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. There's how can you limit a presentation when somebody has been writing 10 books or 10 novels on something and been awarded a Nobel Prize? I don't blame you. You're having a very tough mission, actually. But I would like to include one more person on stage before we start our panel discussion. Professor In-won Ko, please join us on stage. Professor Ko received a doctorate at the University of Kyunghee, where he is also today, at the Humanitas College. Professor Ko received the Young Critics Award in 2006 and is the author of several books. We're very happy to have you here, Professor, and your name has already been mentioned at least once, maybe even twice. And we have heard that the naming of Abdulrazak Gurna as the winner has given rise both to astonishment, and somebody mentioned that, happiness was indicated by Professor Lee, and I would like to hear what's your relation to Abdulrazak Gurna and for him winning this award. Professor Ko.
Well, from my perspective, the Nobel Prize in Literature has the highest prestige in the world in terms of literature awards. And Dr. Gurna winning the award, when it was first announced, my first response was, I was really happy. So I majored in Korean literature, and I am a student of African literature. And the Nobel Prize in Literature being awarded to a non-Western writer from Africa who comes from a continent that I am interested in as a scholar of literature, I was very happy to hear that. And it was also good to hear that one had won from outside the Western world, as Korea is out of that Western world. But one concern that I had was that he isn't well known in Korea, and his work has not been yet translated in Korea. And the committee selecting Dr. Gurna, I had some concerns that they might have been looking at the work to move away from Western culture centric perspectives. And another concern I had was that they might have been considering these the standing of the different regions and continents and cultures instead of the work itself. And that was my impression of the Nobel Prize for this year before I learned about Gurna's work. But I have changed my mind since I've been listening to these presentations. Well, this year's Nobel laureate is not a very well-known writer in some areas, in some parts of the world. However, the Nobel Committee might have been making an effort to move away from Western-centric viewpoints, and I am looking at that in a more positive light.
That's very interesting. I'm also thinking that the Korean Peninsula has its own experiences of displacement and refugees, not comparable or in the same way as East Africa, of course, but in its own way. So I'm curious to hear from all of you three how you see that kind of experience is resonating in the writings of Gurna. If I start with you, Professor Lee.
예, 제 생각에는 한국 시민의 경우
Korean used to be a colony once. We also had a war. So we had these two big events, and this is some history that I personally have a hard time grappling with. And so there are many Korean writers who write about these painful experiences. And I think in that sense, Gurna is quite relevant to Korean literature. And there are writers who write about these painful stories. I think Professor Go In-hwan could reference those writers specifically who has majored in Korean literature.
Well, Korean writers who are in a similar situation as Dr. Gurna, there are quite a few. And so we have something that we call diaspora literature of Korean literature. So the realities of East Africa, we had something quite similar to that in the early 20th century. In the situation of diaspora, Koreans had migrated to Central Asia, Russia, and China, and Japan, and the United States, and many other countries. And they have written literature in Korean or the language of their host country. And so they are writing across borders and ethnicities and building spaces for literature. And these bodies of work from those writers, where are we going to place them in Korean literature or world literature? That kind of discussion is currently taking place. So Gurna's work has quite a lot of implications for Korean readers and Korean literature.
That's very interesting. Professor Olausen, I hope you're able to follow the conversation even if it's partly in Korean. And that you have the English translation. And I wanted to ask you if you also if you see that Gurna's experience that he's writing about is applicable to something more generic than only the part where he comes from. We're talking about whether or not it's applicable to the Korean experience. Do you see it being applicable to other areas of the world than right here, Professor Olausen?
Yes, I'm very, very happy that more readers will now be able to read Gurna's fiction, because I think that the experience of migration and the experience of displacement is shared by so many people, particularly in Sweden today, and that his fiction actually brings about a way of identifying with these characters and following their stories. But he also writes about the vulnerability of children in war areas and so on. So I think that looking back also through European history, there are many families who have these stories. So I think it will enable a sort of discussion also across generations. And I think that is really, really wonderful.
Let me continue with another question to you, Professor Olausen. Gurna seems to be both accessible to regular readers and not, maybe a little bit challenging. On the one hand, we hear of his prose as something being very pleasurable, and certainly for myself, when I experienced the quotes that you showed earlier and that Professor Lee showed, I find them both interesting and pleasurable and quite accessible. But the Swedish Academy, when they describe his work, they also describe him as averse to simplification, compassionate to individuals, but also breaking with convention, frustrating the reader's expectation of a happy ending, not following genre. Would you say he is accessible, or is he a bit of a challenge to take part of? Will he find a broad readership, do you think?
Yes, he will definitely find a broad readership. I really recommend him as an author to people who really want to read just for pleasure, but also for the story. And one of the quotes that Professor Lee showed from Admiring Silence, I think this was a very good quote because it also shows his sense of humor. So even while he is addressing really difficult questions and challenging situations, he also does this with a sense of humor, and I think this is quite wonderful. The way in which he points out the absurdity of certain situations that the migrant can find himself or herself in, but also the pomposity of the people, particularly the Europeans that he sort of meets as a refugee. And those situations are very, very funny. I have a friend who's also researched a lot on him, and she says that, you know, you can sit and read his prose, and then you just want to read some passages out loud because you want to share the fun with someone and you want to laugh at it. So, and it's the language is not difficult in the sense that it would require a lot of a sort of a trained eye. But it's really something that can be enjoyed by a very broad readership. And that is what I think is so great about this year's Nobel Prize.
And Professor Kaur, you already alluded to that he will probably find a readership here in Korea as well. Does it require him to be translated to Korean? Will he find a readership in his original language, or will it need to be in Korean? And does his experience translate? Of course, everything can translate to Korean, but do you see that happening really soon?
예, 저는
Well, I'll be reading it in Korean, the Korean translation. And as Professor Lee, I met him earlier and had dinner with him before we stepped into the symposium, and I heard that the book Paradise, Professor Lee himself said that he has already been chosen as a translator. So we will be able to read Gurna's work very soon in Korean.
Professor, you're going to translate it. That was going to be my next question. Who is going to translate this? But that's fantastic. So we have breaking news from the Nobel Memorial Program. Professor Lee will be translating Gurna's work. That's fantastic. Do you anticipate this with some fear, or are you really looking forward to sinking your teeth in it?
지금 고인원 선생님께서 잘못된 정보
Professor Ko has misinformed you. Nothing has been decided yet. The laureate was announced, and the next day, there's this large publisher in Korea titled Changbi. They contacted me and proposed that maybe we could publish his work. So we are in the course of acquiring the copyrights. But in Korea, when a Nobel Prize winner is decided, there are many Korean publishers, including Minimsa and Munji. There are these publishers competing to get the copyrights. So we're in the middle of this battle for copyrights, and when everything is settled, then I am willing.
I get that, and you're negotiating for the terms also. So let's not pretend that we're too excited until everything is finished. I think we have time for one more question at least. One of the things that Gurna is being described at doing, the Swedish Academy is describing him as he is returning to the individual as being defenseless against things like ideology, institutions, and racism. These institutions of society, and being a victim of it. Let me start with you, Professor Lee. Do you share that view, and that it comes through in his writing? And is it really true? Are we that defenseless, or is it just a narrative that he is very good at introducing?
제가 읽은 소설
The novels that I read will be the base of my answer. I think the common traits of his novels are they are open-ended. They have open endings. And the Swedish Academy, in analyzing his work, has defined as one of the traits, open ending, and that his novels do not have a happy ending. His novels being open-ended, I think, make his stories more realistic. There is the structural pressure oppressing him, like the institutions and racism and ideologies. These large forces oppress him, and he is fighting against them. And can that individual have the power to fight against such huge forces? His novels, just because they don't have a happy ending, does not mean that they have tragic endings. And I don't think that he is personally frustrated. Of course, the forces are gigantic, but not enough to frustrate the individual. Pronounced Jameson, what Frederick Jameson talked about political unconsciousness, when deciding the person's behavior and agency, there's the political unconsciousness that plays, and Bourdieu talked about habitus. These are the agencies that break the individual's structure, and there is interaction, and then a person finds a breakthrough. And so I think they are quite relevant agencies. And the individuals that appear in Gurna's novels, when they're faced with huge institutions like religion and ideologies, these individuals may be portrayed as tragic figures, but the novels do not have a tragic ending. And you can see glimpses of hope in his novels.
I'm Professor Olausen. I'd like to hear you weigh in on this also. And I know it's a very sociologically leaning question. But do you see also this, do you recognize what Swedish Institute is saying?
Yes, and I would agree with the depiction of hope in his novels, that there are moments between people that are described in his novels as the South African professor Tina Steiner has described as conviviality, that this power to change things and the power to actually move beyond really difficult circumstances are connected to small gestures between people, and that these gestures can be identified in his novels, and so that we have this really important aspect also of human life that he sort of returns to. He keeps returning to this question of conviviality, where the individual is not able to overcome the difficulties of structures, but the individual, with the help of other people, living together with others and aiding each other, are able to actually overcome a great deal of difficulties and together actually bring about change.
Thank you very much. I'll let that be the last words of this session. I'm sorry we're out of time. We could have had a much longer conversation because this is a very interesting topic and there are so many layers to this person's writing. I'm very much looking forward to reading it myself. And I wish you luck in your negotiations, both to translate and to get the rights for doing that. That sounds very exciting. Thank you very much, all three of you. And this concludes this session, and I will invite the ambassador to the stage to give a few final words. But first, I think you deserve an applaud for the work that you have done. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, very nice. Thank you very much. Yeah. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, and I would like to conclude just by expressing my gratitude to Professor Maria Olausen and Professor Seok Lee and Professor Inanko for your kind participation and inspiring discussions, and also for taking us through this extraordinary journey of Dr. Gurna's work and explaining to us also how his work has universal appeal. I will not add anything else, just to say that I was very struck by this quote that Professor Olausen showed us from Dr. Gurna's work, and it stuck with me personally, and I would like to read it again. Maps made places on the edges of imagination seem graspable and placeable. So I will end with that quote, and this was also the final of our sessions, and it closes today's Nobel Memorial Program. Thank you to all of you for your participation. Thank you so much. 감사합니다.